So I just want to welcome everyone today to our final research conversation for this semester, for this academic year. I look forward to it next year as well. And I thank all our speakers so far. It's been very informative and really good conversation on the research that's going on in the college. So I thank them for that. And we're happy to have Jeff here today. So AG, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Brian. I'm very pleased to host this and to introduce Jeff. Jeff is an assistant professor of educational leadership at our dynamic health sciences campus in Spokane. His research focuses on caring leadership as well as the organizational dimensions of care and support in educational settings. Today, Jeff will be talking about district leaders' support for caring schools, a normative institutional approach. Dr. Walls.
Well, thank you, AG, and thank you, Brian, for that gracious introduction. I'm happy to be finishing us off for this year. I'm excited to talk about some of my research, which is, I should mention off the top, in progress. So I'm really excited to hear people's feedback because it's still in a formative developmental phase where I am eager to hear people's ideas and critiques and keep kind of improving what I have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can someone just give me a thumbs up that you can see? Okay, brilliant. So as AG said, I'm going to talk about district leaders' support for caring schools. And most of my research to date has focused on caring leadership, but from a school leadership perspective. So primarily principals, assistant principals, and teacher leaders, and how they go about generating a caring school environment, practicing relational caring with one another and with students. And the opportunity arose because I applied for an AERA educational research service grant to expand some of that work to the district level and to sort of look at how district leaders think about supporting caring schools and making sure that they're giving school leaders, teachers, the tools that they need to effectively care for students. And so this is a kind of an initial first brush at what I've learned in that research and some ongoing questions that are still lingering from that. So just to sort of situate where I'm coming at this from, there is some evidence that the Every Student Succeeds Act has opened the door to broader conceptions of what makes a quality school. So moving from a very test-based, achievement-based notion of school quality to a notion of school quality that, for example, incorporates social emotional learning, that looks at the extent to which schools are able to practice equity in their disciplinary practices, and just that adopts multiple measures more generally. On the flip side, there's a lot of evidence that the early approaches to this more expansive notion of school quality have mostly been absorbed into existing routines and paradigms. So the way that this is actually getting implemented in practice looks very similar to the pre-existing kind of notion of how we looked at what makes quality schools. And so I'm a scholar of caring leadership. That's my real emphasis. And so that's sort of the lens at which I'm looking at this challenge through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about caring generally, and then I'm going to sort of dig down to caring leadership specifically. So caring is an intersubjective way of being in a relation to other people or in a relationship with another person. And what that means is it's just another way of saying care can't be a one-way street. So if I say that I care for Brian and Brian hates my guts, for example, there's no caring relationship there. It has to be, I have to intend to care and Brian has to understand my intention to care and actions as caring. In schools, caring is often taken for granted, but we actually have a fair amount of evidence that many students don't experience school as a particularly caring place. So although we think of schools as, this is a site of caring, this is a place where students are cared for by teachers, where students hopefully learn to care about one another, there's evidence that that's not necessarily happening in schools. We also know that caring is, it's not generic, it's culturally and contextually grounded, and that there's a lot of dimensions of organizational life that shape caring. For example, in schools, at times we expect teachers or other adults to exercise power and authority over students, or exercise, for that matter, power and authority with respect to one another. And the way that that happens can have some implications for whether or not the school environment as a whole is caring or is seen as more abrasive, alienating, or problematic. So when we look at caring leadership in particular, most of the work around caring leadership in education, as I mentioned, has been done from the school level. So probably the best known recent conception comes from Smiley, Murphy, and Lewis, and it has 3 elements. There's leader caring, so the idea of actual relational care. How do leaders care in relationships with other school adults or with students? But then there's also cultivating caring communities within the school. So what are the organizational conditions that are likely to lead to a greater density of caring relationships? And how does the organization foster people's capacity to care for one another? And then there's sort of the outreach aspect of caring. How do leaders develop caring contexts outside of the school, in the community, or in sort of policy or institutional environments? So caring leadership has been shown, in the research to facilitate higher levels of trust and to make organizations into better learning organizations that have a better ability to solve and tackle challenges that face them. And my own work, just to sort of situate what I've looked at in the past, has investigated questions such as how caring leaders navigate organizational politics about care. So there's different conceptions of what it means to care in schools. How do leaders sort of navigate that? And what are the implications of that for how caring gets practiced at the school level? And then how do leaders and teachers work to balance their intention to care, or their desire to care for students and to support students with the pressures that they feel to demonstrate their worth in certain ways, to demonstrate I want to care for these kids, at the same time I get sort of judged or evaluated based on students' performance on standardized tests or on students' academic outcomes, and that can produce conflicting pressures. And so this, as I mentioned at the top, was sort of an opportunity to take that paradigm or framework of caring leadership and expand it beyond just the school level to look at it at the district level. So really quickly, just to kind of situate superintendents and district offices and how they've been talked about in the literature a teeny bit. The main thing to know about superintendents is that the role of superintendents has been thought of as really multifaceted. So they're teacher scholars, they're managers, they're democratic leaders, they're applied social scientists, and they're communicators. And they're sort of managing, all of these different roles at different times and balancing the demands of each role. And at the same time, there's been after New Child Left Behind, and so really for the last 15 to 20 years, there's been an emphasis in the literature on what district offices are doing to reorganize themselves to better support learning. So moving from sort of generic, finance functions or human resources functions to aligning all of their practices with the goal of, helping schools be more effective at educating students and at meeting students' needs. And the approach that I'm sort of taking is to look at this from an institutional perspective, and I'm going to try to drill down even a little bit more to a normative institutional perspective. So schools are institutions, and they operate, and I'll read this quote because I like it, they operate based on a set of beliefs, practices, and structures that are long held, value-laden, and widely accepted as appropriate, even when they may no longer accomplish desired functions or outcomes. So schools have an institutional background that sort of governs the way that they behave. We take certain things that schools do for granted, even when we can't necessarily explain very well why that's still a good idea or a good approach for schools to take. And so there's sort of three ways of looking at or conceiving of institutions. There's a regulative pillar of institutions, which is really laws, policies, regulations. There's a normative pillar of institutions, which refers to the social rewards and social sanctions that people in institutional roles receive. So you're more likely to behave if you work in an institution in a way that it is viewed as legitimate and is rewarded by that institution. And you're more likely to avoid behaviors that sort of rock the boat, even if you feel like they might lead to better outcomes. And then there's the cultural and cognitive pillar, which is basically relates to how people think about what the role of the institution is in society, and then where they fit into what that role is. And so I'm mostly going to try to, although there's some aspects of all three pillars that will show up in this work, I'm going to try to mostly frame my results in terms of a normative institutional approach. And one of the things that I like about a normative institutional approach is that it looks at questions of behavior through this lens of a logic of appropriateness versus a logic of consequence. So in a logic of appropriateness, actions are, March said, matched to situations by means of rules organized into identities. Or to put that in a different way, Honig in 2006 wrote, when decision makers follow a logic of appropriateness, they fit a situation to a particular identity. These decision makers will ask, what is most efficient in this situation, and choose that approach. Or they will not ask what is most efficient and choose that approach. Rather, they will ask, who am I in this situation, and what behaviors are appropriate to that identity in this particular situation, and make their choices based on the answers to those questions. So they're conceiving of what they ought to do in terms of what behaviors are seen as appropriate. A couple of reasons that I think that a normative approach applies particularly when we're looking at this question. One is that caring is a social and relational phenomena. So understanding the way people act in terms of what's perceived as being legitimate or will benefit them socially versus will not benefit them socially sort of fits in with a caring way or a relational way of seeing the world and of seeing choices. The other reason that I think a normative approach is helpful in this case is that the districts in this study are sort of a regional cluster of districts. They're all districts that are located near to each other. And so the district leaders spend a lot of their time looking at what nearby districts are doing and talking to each other about the approach that they're taking. And so it's easy to see how they sort of construct legitimacy in terms of what their peers, their nearby peers are doing. So just a teeny bit about what I actually did, the data that I collected. So all the data in this study comes from superintendents, assistant superintendents or associate superintendents, and directors of student or special services. And it was across 14 districts. There were 27 total folks that I talked to. In every case, I talked to the superintendent, and then I would usually conclude the interview or near the end of the interview by asking, who else should I talk to about these issues? And I'll get to what the particular questions were, but kind of the broad issue is, what does the district central office do to support caring in schools? The districts are quite different. So they range from around 30,000 students to all the way down to just about 150 students in the whole district. 14 of the people I talked to were men and 13 were women. But every superintendent except for one was a man. And so it was a pretty common structure in these districts that the superintendent was male and the assistant associate or associate superintendent was female. And that was just sort of the common trend in this region or in this set of districts. And as I mentioned, all the districts are in the Pacific Northwest, and they're all part of kind of the same grouping because that was part of the nature of the grant, the service aspect of the grant. So the two broad questions were, One, how do district leaders describe caring and supportive schools? So this question of, if we're asking district leaders, what is it that you're doing to support caring in schools? We need to know what they understand to be sort of the goal of their support, right? What is the sort of school that you're trying to produce or create or influence through your support? And then how do district leaders support those schools? So how do they describe caring? And then what are they doing in their role to support schools in being caring? And what does that look like? And so the data analysis, and this is where I want to emphasize again, is very much in progress. So this is an ongoing set of questions that I'm still certainly investigating and trying to figure out kind of what's going on. So what I did was, the first thing that I did was I wrote brief summaries of all of the interviews that sort of detailed the themes in these interviews. And from the interviews, and then also from the literature that I reviewed earlier, I generated both inductive and deductive codes. So the inductive codes were generated from the sort of thematic analysis of the interview, and the deductive codes came from the literature itself, especially the literature around caring leadership and institutional understandings of organizations. I'm right now kind of in the process of identifying and categorizing the described supports that folks in these interviews describe based on that set of coding. And so what I'm trying to do, and this is what I'm really in the process of, is trying to understand which of these supports or which of these groups of supports are governed primarily by a logic of appropriateness, and which of them are governed by a logic of consequences, and which are ambiguous or sort of might be sometimes governed by a logic of appropriateness and other times governed by a logic of consequences. So not necessarily a neat categorization, but probably a little bit more of a spectrum in the end. And at the very end, I'll have some conjecture or some things to share with you about that, about sort of what I'm beginning to learn, I think. And the final stage, and I haven't really started this, is comparison across districts and across roles. So how do superintendents see things differently than assistant superintendents, and so on and so forth. And that I haven't even begun. So there's not going to be much role differentiation reported in the results. So I'm going to share a couple findings related to that first question, and then a number of groups related to the second question. So the first question is, how are district leaders sort of seeing caring? How are they, when they describe what makes a school a caring and supportive place, how are they describing that? And one thing that's definitely coming through very strongly in the findings is that leaders see caring as a natural state. So I'm not going to read these quotes to you. I'll leave the slide up for a moment, but I'll just kind of talk through. So leaders see caring as natural, as sort of what adults in schools naturally do to students, and sort of the approach that adults naturally take with them to school. And as a result of that, they do see part of their role as sort of removing barriers or removing obstacles. If caring is natural, all we have to do to let caring flourish in schools is to get rid of the things that stand in the way of caring, or try to disrupt those things. The leaders also saw caring, they described caring in very affective terms. So caring is sort of the affect that you bring to school. And the most common descriptions of caring talk about smiles. They talk about high levels of interaction, high adult visibility, and warm and welcoming interactions. And that there's student work on walls and in common spaces. So the theme is a very sociable, sort of pro-social affect, and that's how you sort of understand what caring is. On the other hand, there was really a lot less consensus on what caring looked like in learning environments. So some district leaders said that caring you can tell a place is caring by if you see what looks like chaos in the classroom. Versus other leaders who said, things like kids like structure. We show that we care by creating structure, or that the school should feel calm. And if the school is calm, then it will be caring. So less agreement on that, but much more agreement on sort of the affect generally. And then I'm going to transition to talking about sort of lumps or clusters of what district leaders said that they did to support caring within these schools. So the most common, I would say, way that district leaders talked about how they supported caring was by assisting schools in systems implementation. So almost all of the folks that I interviewed spoke to about this in some form. And they really centered on PBIS systems, so positive behavior intervention systems, the multi-tiered systems of support that the district used, the SEL curriculum, which most districts have, all districts in the Pacific Northwest now are required to have some form of SEL programming, and most of the districts in the study had adopted a formal curriculum. Or they talked about, how do we support schools in figuring out how the SEL curriculum is aligned or fits into our multi-tiered systems of support, or how does our multi-tiered systems of support fit into our PBIS system. So helping schools to sort of align systems. And another emphasis was integrating these systems into school improvement planning. So as schools every year figure out what their school improvement planning goals are going to be, how do these systems fit into that? Another way that they described supporting schools was through professional development and capacity building. So for the most part, these districts do a lot of centralized professional development for teachers, and that's how they introduce, in particular, a lot of their new initiatives. So I'm not going to read the quote, but just to zero in on a couple of things. The types of professional development that were most often talked about were either trauma-informed professional development, so professional development related to adverse childhood experiences, or discipline systems such as sound discipline. And those were, they saw those forms of professional development as ways of either giving educators tools or of changing educators' beliefs about what they were trying to do or accomplish in their classrooms. The third, and I'm not going to linger here because I've already sort of talked about it when I talked about that district leaders saw caring as natural. And so they did frequently talk about that one of their big roles was to remove barriers or to provide autonomy to schools and get principals to do what they thought was best to produce more caring. Different superintendents kind of framed it differently. Some of them talked more about autonomy and like helping leaders to act in the way that they thought was most beneficial. And others did emphasize more on removing barriers, but nearly all of the district leaders I spoke to emphasized sort of either one or the other or both of these aspects of their work. A fourth area that district leaders spoke about was relational modeling and support for adults. So most district leaders describe basically going through a process of modeling what caring relationships look like with the administrators that they most frequently worked with, so with principals and assistant principals, and that they hope that that would serve as a model for respectful and caring interaction among staff members at the schools. So two different, and perhaps it was something that they'd encountered in a training or that somebody had said, but in two different districts, they had the metaphor of putting your own mask over your face before assisting others. So the classic airplane metaphor, and emphasizing, that we need to care about ourselves and we need to care about and support one another in order to effectively support students. Another thing that came up numerous times in this was an emphasis about what to be tight on versus what to be loose on. So what do we really need to make sure this is happening in every school or this is happening in every classroom, versus what are areas where we can allow more flexibility, and for example, let people go early from a professional development because it's more important that they have more time to spend in their classroom rather than be kept in this professional development longer, especially during the COVID era, as a lot of these district superintendents were worried about people burning out as the year went on. And then there's two more kind of lumps or areas that these district leaders talked about as far as supporting schools. One was in personnel. And this was, again, I think, well over half. I don't think it was nearly all, but it was probably close to 2/3 of the superintendents and district leaders talked about, hiring the right people and choosing sort of with discretionary budget money, what are the positions or what are the areas that we need to hire for? And so there were really varied emphases in how district leaders describe spending and they emphasize their very limited resources in trying to support schools. Some talked about counselors, others mental health therapists, others talked about academic support specialists, care coaches, or restorative discipline specialists. And then other people focused on hiring additional support staff at the district office level. So hiring an assistant director of teaching and learning to focus on SEL, or hiring dedicated staffing for student services, such as overseeing McKinney-Vento and offering help and support to students experiencing homelessness. But this was an area where there was a great deal of sort of variation in what people saw that money as being best spent on. But most of the folks did emphasize that, making intentional choices about personnel was a way that they supported schools. And then the last area, the last sort of chunk that I want to talk about is identifying gaps and problem solving. So over half of the participants really said that one thing that they did was sort of surveying systems or surveying existing supports, existing policies, existing practices, and finding gaps, figuring out, what's missing, which students are we missing, which families are we missing, and then taking steps to sort of plug those holes or figure out, how best to meet that need that wasn't being met right now. So some examples, one superintendent talked about counselor affinity groups for students facing particular challenges, such as divorce or lack of friendships, partnerships to bolster family engagement. A lot of superintendents and assistant superintendents talked about homelessness as being a problem and supporting youth experiencing homelessness. And then finding ways to support average performing but disconnected students. So just to quickly kind of wrap up, and as I said, the findings are a little bit more descriptive at this point than analytical, because I'm still going through the analysis process. But I'm going to say a couple things about sort of the way that superintendents saw care, and then I'm going to say a couple things really quickly about the differing ways that superintendents supported schools in caring. So with respect to the way that superintendents and district leaders saw care, one concern that's been raised by past scholars with a really affective and natural view of caring is who might be missed by those views. So caring is not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon, as I mentioned at the top. And care and affect aren't necessarily tied. You can show that you care for people, not necessarily by smiling or being warm. Frequently, that is how it works. But there's times when appropriate ways to show that you care might be righteous anger or indignation. There's many ways of showing care, and they're not all tied to affect. And equity, I was just sort of surprised given the how frequently it comes up. It wasn't something that many of these district leaders mentioned in connection to caring schools. And so that was just sort of a surprising initial finding. With respect to the actions that district leaders are taking to support schools and caring for students. This is what I think I'm sort of starting to find, is that I think that the systems implementation and the professional development strategies or actions that are being taken are often being driven by a logic of appropriateness, where this is sort of an expected role that district leaders have in systems implementation and in helping develop staff. They're sort of legally bound to do it. But one thing that emerged from the interviews is that a lot of these districts are sort of adopting the same programs, and they're usually kind of regionally developed programs. And they're also emphasizing sort of, removal of barriers and getting systems fit into what the school is already doing. So it's kind of trying to make it as easy as possible on their superintendents and teachers, rather than as much focus on the change that the systems could make. The relational modeling is kind of in between. It seemed neither governed by a logic of appropriateness nor a logic of consequence. And instead, it seemed very often tied to COVID-19 and the particulars of this pandemic year. And then personnel and bespoke problem solving were the areas that seemed most driven by a logic of consequence. So there's really a great deal of variation in the emphasis of who was going to be hired or what problems most needed to be solved were most pressing. And this is where superintendents really kind of most articulated their vision for, this is how I think that solving this problem can move the school forward, or this is how hiring this group of people is really going to support these schools and move things forward. So there's a great deal more variation and a great deal more articulation of like what the broader theory of action behind that work is. And then I'll conclude, and then I'll stop talking because I really do want to leave lots of time for feedback and questions. There's a couple other studies that are emerging from this. One is a study of how rural superintendents are responded to the pandemic, because all of these interviews were conducted during the pandemic year, and so trying to look at how rural superintendents are making sense of the challenges they faced in their communities. And then the other study, which is kind of a burgeoning interest of mine, has to do with moral distress. And moral distress is when somebody knows what the right thing to do is, quote unquote, in a situation, but they're prevented from doing so by something, by the limits of their organization or political concerns. And so I'm interested in understanding, when do superintendents feel moral distress? And how do they kind of grapple with that? Even though they're the nominal leaders of districts, they also experience many constraints. And so I want to understand what that looks like from a leadership perspective. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. And I welcome any questions, feedback, critique, anything.
Jeff, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the logic of appropriateness. It seems it really works against caring, and your whole idea, that moral distress really interests me, because that's the kind of moral conundrum that is very difficult to work around. Do you see that as related as sort of moral distress, along with this, the fact that the logic of appropriateness has such a sort of overarching kind of pressure on people?
Well, so it's a good question. So what I'm finding, I think there are ties, right? But I think that one of the things about a logic of appropriateness to note is that people feel that appropriateness confers legitimacy on their actions, and so they're not necessarily as likely to be morally bothered as long as they feel that their actions are appropriate or that they feel they're legitimate. And so one of the things that is emerging from the moral distress parts of the data analysis is that superintendents are somewhat less likely to feel what I would call actual moral distress than assistant superintendents or directors of student services, because superintendents tend to see the problems that might cause other people moral distress as being either technical problems or political problems. It's either, this is a challenge that I need to try to ameliorate or deal with, or this is something that, I'm just going to have to compromise. Whereas other people see it as like, no, this is, these kids are not getting what they need, or these special education students are not getting services that they're, legally mandated to have. And that's causing me real distress, like actual. And so that's kind of the distinction. Does that answer your question, AG?
Yeah, that helps to fill it out. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Others?
Hey everyone, and hey Jeff, I thought that was so fantastic. I'm also very interested in this idea of moral distress. And I wondered if it's at all drawing on the work of Mira Levinson and moral injury. Are you familiar?
No, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, well, so she's talking about teachers specifically, but it's essentially saying like we put teachers in these roles where there's no good option, right? Either you're in violation of what you're supposed to do, or you carry out what you're supposed to do, and then you're maybe harming a student. So yeah, that's kind of a formulation that you might look into. And she suggests as sort of the remedy to moral injury as being moral repair. And she talks about sort of society owing this repair to teachers, to not put people in positions in which they have these impossible choices to make. But then the other piece that I was really interested in was sort of this assumption that the school is a naturally caring state. And it makes sense, right? Like if that's your view, then it's like, well, things get in the way. And my job is just to kind of knock off these pieces so that things can proceed in the natural direction. And I guess I wonder, I mean, yeah, I'm sitting here like just questioning that premise. And if we didn't see, if school leaders didn't view the school as kind of like having this natural resting state of care, how might that change our approach to the lack of care that we see in schools, right? Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. Thank you for that awesome presentation.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, and I think that is, and I guess that from a normative perspective, that's part of what I'm pushing for, I guess, is I think that we do need to disrupt this sense of care as being natural. But I think, because I think that is, that's borne out in other research as well, that people really do see that. And it's not necessarily true. Students often don't feel cared for at school, and especially, marginalized students. So yeah, thank you.
Others?
Hey, Jeff, thanks. Thanks. It's a great presentation. I agree. One of the things I think about when we think about the systems kind of changing, and we're doing some of this thinking around testing in schools now, of where different changes have to happen for it to occur over the long term for the better. And when hearing you talk, I'm trying to, in my mind, think about and then have you guys talk about what are the innovative ways that we're looking at training educational leaders in the area of caring. So when they go into the schools, into their jobs, they have a framework for this, and not just trying to, like, I think what you said, you're finding just putting some aspects into the same system that's there and perhaps just kind of perpetuating things that aren't working. So what are some of the innovations you're thinking about, or the field's thinking about, in terms of how do we work on the training side to really integrate this not into the same system, but change that system?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that in some ways it's still in its infancy, but I think that one of the things that is maybe not in its infancy, but it's still it's burgeoning. But one of the things that I think, because caring is relational and intersubjective, right? You can't care without the person that you're trying to care for experiencing it as care. I think that a lot of the work, and some of it that my colleague Catherine Rodella is doing about meaningfully bringing in student voices, parent voices, community voices, and making that, broadening our understanding of what educational leadership really is central to this work. Because I think that unless you can do that, you can't really have a good sense of what constitutes caring for different people, and what that looks like in the organizational fabric of the school. I think that's one area that we're growing into. And I think the other area that we're growing into, and hopefully it continues, is just helping school leaders and to a large extent district leaders think about the school improvement process in more expansive ways. So understanding, there is an emphasis on sort of academic press, but understanding sort of the climactic and school cultural elements that underlie that in a way that isn't sort of like, well, if everybody likes each other, then things are going to be fine, but a richer or deeper way. That is kind of another developmental thing that is happening in leadership education, I think. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Jeff, somewhat related to Brian's question, and by the way, thank you for a great presentation. So many years ago, I'm talking many years ago, one of my doctoral students interviewed, I think 12 superintendents around the Sound area. And he was exploring the notion of multicultural education then. And so it was similar, trying to find out where do the superintendents stand in terms of multicultural education and issues of diversity in their districts. And so what I recall from his work was that while the talk was always good about what they were doing or the district was doing, as he interviewed other folks along, from the superintendent down, so to speak, some of those efforts diluted. And then it ended up in the teacher showing a lot of energy and effort for diversity issues. And so related to whose voices are on the table, so to speak, there was a disconnect, correct, throughout this line. And then there was a disconnect in terms of the documentation that was there in the district in terms of policies. And so I'm wondering if this issue of whose voices are on the table has to do with this notion of caring.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I hadn't thought about it that way. And I wonder too, I think it would be interesting to try to do this study in a more vertical way where I'm, trying to understand what so we sort of know how district leaders in these districts see it, but then I don't know very much about how principals in these districts see it or how teachers in these districts see it. And I'm hoping to do some studies related to that. But I think that is really interesting to, it makes me wonder, in part two, sort of how we saw how people saw their jobs. Because these district leaders really are thinking, or were thinking largely in terms of systems, right? What are the systems that we're creating that, like one, superintendent said, what are the systems we're creating that are going to catch kids or that are going to, and that way of thinking is sort of very different than the perspective of a classroom teacher who's like, these are the 4 or 5 kids that, I haven't been able to develop a caring relationship with. And it's kind of so it's just, I think that perspective would be interesting to try to, square the circle of, is like, how are we seeing systems versus relationships at the up and down levels. I think that's an interesting way of thinking. Thank you, Gisela.
Well, it makes me think it's very multi-dimensional, right? So like Jeff, I think you mentioned Catherine's work of thinking about the student and parent and guardian voices coming into this. The line that Gisela, I like saying, where does this start and how does it kind of play out at the high level versus the teacher classroom level? And all those different voices to me have probably slightly and maybe vastly different ideas of what caring is and how it looks like, including the different backgrounds you come from. So the question in my mind is how do you come to some definition and then action on that kind of transcends those space where everyone agrees, and how do you get there?
Yeah, and I think the districts that are doing the sort of exemplar districts that are doing the work that people are looking to about this, it is a very kind of community engaged process where there's a lot of coming up with what do these definitions look like, and what does it mean do this. And I would say that, some of the districts in this study are closer to that, and most of them are farther from that. But I think that that's I think I agree strongly.
Jeff, I want you to unpack this statement that you had in there from one of the participants. If adults aren't happy, kids aren't cared for. Can you deconstruct that a little bit? Because
Well, hey,
it's a very rich kind of statement, and it leads me to want to know more.
yeah, it was, yeah. So I can tell you what happened after that, because it's very axiomatic, right? Like if we can make the adults happy, then they can care for the kids, and if the adults aren't happy, then and so I followed up and I said, like, so can you explain, what you're thinking when you say that? And the part that stuck out to me about the response was, and this was, a fairly common sentiment, was that making adults happy seemed very related to supporting working conditions and supporting, like, adults' professional needs. So it's kind of like, if we can make sure that adults feel like they are, supported by their principal, like they have the supplies they need in their classroom and the curriculum materials that they need in their classroom, then they'll be happier, then they'll be pleased, right? And it didn't, and I pushed on this a little bit, but it didn't very much encompass what I think of as, just general happiness, right? Where it's like, do I feel like a whole and well-supported person? It was much more kind of, do I have what I need to be an effective professional? And that was kind of how the superintendent was thinking about happiness amongst adults. So, I don't really know what to there's limits to how much you can interrogate beat a dead horse in an interview, but I agree that was a statement that was really interesting to me.
We've got time for at least another question.
I have a question, and great job, Jeff. I think this is really interesting and great I've heard about the project before, but it's exciting to kind of start seeing some of the findings and initial themes coming out of the work. So I guess I have a kind of two parts. One, you were, and of course it piqued my interest, and all of it, I'm just like, oh my gosh, all the the idea of natural caring. And I was like, oh my gosh, like PBIS does not feel safe for a lot of kids. And so that they're like, we're doing these systems, and we work with folks, right? Like we know a lot of the folks. And so I guess I was curious more about your thinking around equity, because I think from a national conversation in the literature, that'd be really, there's emerging critiques of SEL. And I think, I wonder how you're thinking about that, and parallel, because to me, the lack of discussion around equity when this study was happening, over the last 7 months or so, like right after, we're in COVID, racial justice movements, and it's not even seemingly on their radar, when this seems like a natural fit to thinking about this and, caring, belonging, all these elements, particularly for students of color and other marginalized students. So I'm wondering, I would like to hear more about your, that was surprising to you. And then the second piece is the politics of your study itself, because the parallel of that question is we also navigate the relationships that we have with folks. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, I haven't figured out exactly the question, formulating it, but just your thinking around, there's some critical elements of this, right? You're kind of the mirror on what they're not acknowledging in terms of, and what's come up in conversation around the differing perspectives depending on the communities. And so I just wonder kind of what your thoughts are in those two elements, the wondering about equity and the lack of consideration of equity and their responses in a number of them, and then the politics of your own study. How are you thinking about sharing and disseminating this? Because there's this element of I don't know if that makes sense. There's not critical of them, but also there's some problematic kind of things here that I think need to be unpacked more. Yep. Not with the study, but what we're learning. Yeah.
No, I agree. Well, the second one is very much on my mind, because one of the, the upshots of the grant is that I need to produce a public of course, this is public too, but a public document that has some, kind of advice and potential activities or professional development approaches that might be useful. And so, presenting my findings in a way that's developmentally oriented is very much on my mind. The equity, and I think it ties with, so there's a couple of things going on in the background. One is superintendents and district leaders are, generally quite politically savvy people. Their jobs are very political. And so I'm not sure the extent to which, they're always leveling 100% with me versus the extent to which they're being guarded in their answers. And of course, there's things I can do as an interviewer to try to push that. But one of the things that emerged when people did talk about equity is it was sort of framed around, this is a conversation we're starting in our district. It's something that we need to be, better at, stronger at. And then it was very quickly a pivot to sort of the constraints that the community would put on that conversation. And so there was a very explicit political element for these superintendents within that. And so I don't think that, folks, if you have to leave, totally fine. I don't want to, don't stay on my account. So it's certainly something that, I think will be interesting to puzzle through how much I can push on and how much I can, unpack and at this, and at the same time acknowledge that people are constrained at times by communities and are, doing a hard job and are doing the best they can and can nonetheless always improve. So if you have ideas, Catherine, I'd love to hear them, but it's certainly on my mind.
I have one idea. I'm just curious, would they loose couple on academic press? They'll loose couple on cell or equity. Will they loose couple on academic press?
Yeah, I don't know. And that's something that, so one of the things that came up with respect to that, and that's a question that I kind of did push on at times, was the question of competency, right? Because a lot of superintendents framed it as like, well, I know how to push on academic press, and so I know what I can expect of people and get people to do and what I can't. And on these other elements, these, cell, PBIS, caring generally, I don't know what it means to push on that. And I don't know what it means to ease up on that. I don't know. And so that was just sort of a lot of them framed it as like a knowledge and skill question of like, I don't know what that means. And so I'm going to lean on what I know. And I think that was, interesting in and of itself.
Jeff, thank you very much. This has been a great final research conversation. Brian, would you like to say anything about next year?
We're in the planning stages. We're already reaching out to people over the summer to plan for at least fall, 3 to 4 speakers. So if you're interested in presenting or have colleagues you think would be interested in presenting, please let me know and we'll add them to the list and be reaching out to people. Again, I thank all our speakers this year. It's been a great session. The conversations have been very informative and I've appreciated the effort gone into these. So thank you.
Thanks you, everybody.
Take care.